In the final game in our series on the classical Dutch, and from the black point of view, should I mention, we're going to have a look at a game between some two players that don't involve me. So we've got Henriks with the white pieces against Igor Glek with the black pieces. Igor Glek, very strong player. I mean, he's been over 2,600 before, and he has played the Dutch on and off for his life. It should be noted that even though the classical Dutch is not so popular nowadays, it has been played by some of the world's best players. Macau Tau famously won a great game with the classical Dutch. Botvinnik has played the Dutch. Alekijn, another Dutch player. Nigel Short nowadays, currently, well, has played the Dutch a couple of times. So it has got a history of strong players playing it. It just doesn't seem to be very popular at this moment in time. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why. So in this game, the final game of our series, we're just going to have a look at a typical middle game position that arise through the Dutch and another great victory from Black. We're also going to very quickly, only very quickly, briefly mention other setups that White might adopt after two or three moves. So we're not going to look at anti-Dutch systems. So anti-Dutch systems start with d4, f5, and here there's a number of anti-Dutch systems, which I would implore you to study as well if you want to start the game with 1f5. Now, I will start the game with 1e6 to avoid these systems, but of course, the French defense may not be in your repertoire after e4. So, I mean, anti-Dutch systems after f5 you have to be aware of are the Staunton gambits. I know Thomas Rendell has covered this, so you might be able to look at his video there. Early bishop g5 move, so that's another line you might want to look at. Knight to c3 in this position. They're the three main moves, should I say, in the Dutch defense, the anti-Dutch. But we're going to have a look at positions. Okay, well, the move order was slightly different here. I mean, g3, knight f6, I'd say go e6 there. But after bishop g2, e6, not much has changed here. And we're quickly getting to our normal type of position. So from what else can white play after something like e6? Now c4, f5. What other kind of structures can white go for if he doesn't try to fianchetto this bishop on g2? Well, as a bit of advice, this is a simple bit of advice. If white doesn't fianchetto his bishop on g2 and he tries to put it on e2 or d3, I would recommend you stick with a plan of going b6 and bishop b7. So these are different positions to what we've looked at, but you're trying to take advantage of the fact that your opponent hasn't put his bishop on g2. So in order to achieve this, you can go knight to f6 first, bishop to e7 first, see how your opponent sets up his pieces, and then go b6. So for example, let's say he goes knight to c3, we go knight to f6, and let's say he plays something strange like e3 here. The idea of going bishop to d3. Well, I remember one game that I'll just quickly show you this game, which continued b6, because now it's clear white doesn't want to put his bishop on g2. And now, again, continued bishop to d3, bishop to b7, knight to f3. So I expect you'll get this a lot at club level. Bishop to b4. So now that your bishop, I mean, in the regular lines, we put it on e7, but sometimes it can be put on b4. And in this position, it makes a lot of sense to put it on b4 because really you're fighting for control of the e4 square with your bishop on b7, your knight on f6. So the bishop on b4 increases the control on e4 by pinning the knight on c3. And now there's one great game I saw which continued. I'll just show it very quickly. Castle's kingside, a3, black took, knight to e4. So this move comes in again. Queen c2, and now a lovely idea here called the rook lift idea, and this only works when your opponent has not fianchettoed his bishop. Rook to f6 with a simple plan of moving this rook to g6 or h6 and checkmating the black king. And this is a lovely idea. The game in question continued a4, rook g6, lining up some nasty ideas here, and now a5. And there was some devastating attack here, I believe, which continued with knight to g5. And all pieces were released against g2. And this ended very quickly, the game in question. So this is one idea worth bearing in mind if your opponent develops his bishop to d3. But I'd say wait and see. And if he does do something else here, then you can go b6. b6 is a logical move. Now his knight's on c3. You can consider going bishop to b4 as well. That's the way I'd probably play this position. This is why in a lot of top class games, white generally doesn't play his knight to c3 too quickly. So he might continue something like c4, f5, and now if he goes g3, we're back into our main line. And if he goes knight to f3, we can go knight to s6. So we're still waiting to see what opponent does. And if he goes knight to c3, we can go bishop to b4. So this would be my other recommendation. If he goes knight to c3 too soon, go bishop to b4. Now, we don't go bishop to b4 in the main lines after g3 because of knight to d2 check. And I don't particularly like these ideas, these variations for black. So only when your opponent has gone knight to c3 can you try bishop to b4. Now, what other things have people tried against me? Well, I've had, let's say, knight to c3 in this position, knight to f6, and bishop to g5 here. Now, this is quite a crafty idea because often white is aimed to take on f6 and go pawn to e4. And this is something you have to be aware of. Now, again, I think here you have time to play b6 quickly because often this b6 move is a great idea. And then there's one game I had where my opponent tried this idea prematurely of taking f6 and going e4. And here I was simply able to take and play a very annoying bishop to b4 check. But okay, I mean, generally, we're not going to go into it in too much depth. But as a general rule, I think worth remembering that in these positions earlier on, the classical Dutch, you have to be quite flexible. If your opponent goes for the kingside fianchetto, then just aim for the stuff we've looked at in previous videos. If he plays other lines, then you don't have to play with your bishop on e7. If he puts his knight on c3 too quickly, you can put your bishop on b4. So that's one way to play. If he puts his bishop on d3 rather than g2, then you can develop your bishop to b7. And you can even consider, once you've castled, the rook lift idea when he's castled as well, of checkmating his king. So just bear in mind all these ideas when playing the classical Dutch. But now let's move on to the game in question, have a look at this typical middle game position that was reached. So g3 was played, here, here, here. So we get our standard stuff, and we know how we're going to develop now. We're going to go bishop e7, castles, d6. Very straightforward. White plays c4. Now bishop to e7, back into our normal line, knight to f3. Both sides castled, and black played d6. So white now played knight to c3. Now, we've looked at queen c2 in my first game against Wojciech. We have looked briefly at knight to c3 against Shirov, my game against Shirov. And Gelfand played b4 against me here. Now, another move that's quite common is a move b3. How do you think you should play against this? I just want to give you 5 seconds with all the knowledge you should have obtained from the first 4 videos of how you should play against this move. Well, you should play knight to e4 here. This is your best line. By playing b3, white has slightly weakened this diagonal, and the standard idea for black in these positions is to go knight e4, bishop to f6, and pressurize. And here, this is a great move. After bishop to b2, you can go bishop to f6 here. And again, now your standard plan here is something like knight to c6, e5. This is what you're aiming for in this type of position. And you can look at this in more depth in the databases. You know, there's a bit of theory on this, but this is your general way of thinking in this line. Just go knight to e4. Okay, but in the game in question, knight to c3 was played. And hopefully you can remember what I suggested as black's best move here. Knight to e4. Yep. And okay, now we're going to get to a typical middle game position. And the reason I wanted to include this game is because I've seen this middle game position, and in my own experience, the type of position we're going to reach here comes up in the majority of games. So I think it's very important for you to understand what ideas you're trying to achieve in the middle game. And this is with queen to c2. So now you take on c3. So by playing your knights into the center and exchanging off a pair of pieces, you had a cramped position, but exchanges are good when you have a cramped position. Queen takes c3 was played, and now b4 is an annoying idea in a lot of positions, as we saw Gelfand play. So a5, trying to gain space and maybe put a knight on b4 later on and just gain a bit of space on the queen side. I like this move, a5. And now b3 was played. Now, I'm just trying to test your memory here from the first game because we've had a bit of games in between. And I did ask you about this position. I said, what is your plan here? Now, please have a think about what plan you should be playing here with black. Hopefully by now you've got to grips with the opening principles and even the middle game principles. What moves should you be trying to achieve in this position? How can you achieve that move? How can you get your pieces out to the best potential squares? Well, Gleck played bishop to f6, the best move. And this is the plan. You want to go e5. e5 is one of your main objectives in the classical Dutch. And to prepare to move e5, your bishop helps out defend the square. Your knight can also help out defend the square. And your queen, if needed, can come to e8, and in some cases, even e7. This is your main idea. You want to go e5 and even g5 later, and just gain space on this side of the board. So bishop f6 is the first stage for achieving this. Bishop to b2. What do you play next? Knight to c6, the correct move. Pressurizing d4 and preparing e5. Now, quick question. Just try to think about this in your head, in your mind's eye. What move as black do you have to normally be worried about when you play knight to c6? There's one move you need to be concerned about on a general basis when you play knight to c6. Well, normally the move you have to worry about is d5 from white. This is the move that you normally stops you playing knight to c6 earlier on because d5 breaks up your pawn structure. Clearly d5 is not possible here because the queen on c3 would be munched. So we don't want to do that. Okay, and now rook on a to d1 was played. So white temporarily stops you playing e5. Or if you do play e5, you don't get the position you'd like to get. Because whenever white takes on e5, you want to catch back with your pawn. And you want to keep your two pawns centralized like this. And here, that will always give you a better middle game position. But clearly, you cannot play this now because of the pin on your pawn. So what do you play after rook d1? How do you get over this? Well, queen to e8, another standard idea. The queen steps out of the way of the rook, gives even more protection to the move e5, and prepares in some positions to come over to h5. This is a lovely, really well played game. Rook on fe1. So white is preparing his own play with e4. What move should you play here as black? Thematic middle game play. e5. Yep, this is the move. Now you can play e5. You should play e5. I'm always happy in this type of position if my opponent closes a position down with d5. After I move my knights, I have a great pawn storm coming up on the king side and a very good attack. So the best option here for white is always to capture on e5. And now Gleck took back on e5. Here the threat is pawn to e4. Already black has gained a very decent space advantage here. But the only mistake Gleck made in this game is that after e4, he played the slightly inferior move queen to g6 here. Now, I've actually had this in 2 games myself. The way to continue against this e4 move, you can, by the way, you can consider playing f4, which is interesting. But the best move here is pawn takes e4, rook takes e4, runs into bishop to f5. And then after the rook moves back, we can play e4, which is actually winning for black because our bishops are too strong. So the best line after taking for white is to try to go knight to d2 here. So we just, and then black again, it's in the Dutch, it's all about developing with tempo, with speed. Bishop to g4, attacking the rook. And when the rook moves, knight to d4. All pieces are going forwards. And look, we're a pawn up, we're threatening knight to e2, we're winning the game. This is just a very strong idea. So even against a strong player, you can still get very good positions. So the best way to meet e4 in a number of options is to take e4. And also now you can see why some of the things I was saying earlier on in my videos and the previous videos about leaving the bishop on c8 come into action here. Well, actually, you often leave the bishop on c8 because it wants to come out to a more active square later on in the game. There's no point putting it on d7 or e6. It has better potential later on. So I think this e4 move doesn't really help the case for white. But okay, let's have a look at the game because it's still a very interesting middle game position. Black played queen to g6, makes a lot of sense. And white took, and now bishop takes f5. And again here, well, black is better here still. I think taking on e4 is more superior. But this is the kind of position you're aiming for when playing the classical Dutch. This is like your typical position, every piece developed, knight developed, bishop's very active, queen active. Your isolated pawn does not matter so much because it can actually be used as a strength. But your pieces are much better than white's pieces. And let's just see how Gleck used this initiative to gain a good position. Well, queen to e3, getting out of the way of the bishop, but e4 was played anyway, using this isolated pawn to attack with. Knight to d4. And now bishop takes d4, simply rook to d8. And all of black's pieces are working well. h3, preparing g4. h5, stopping this plan. Bishop to c3, and now the rook comes into d3. And this isolated pawn, as we can see, is slowly becoming a very strong pawn. Okay, I mean, I don't know if black's advantage is so great. He should have taken on e4 earlier. But the way the game continues, he slowly outplayed his opponent. And okay, I mean, white sort of played this bishop d5 check at some stage. But the big chance here really that Gleck missed, rather than going queen to g6, we won't look at the rest of the game because it's pretty irrelevant. Instead of queen g6, which was played, he should have captured on e4. And this, as we just noted, would have led to a very good position and very good play for black. But again, very thematic from black. The whole opening strategy worked out well. Let's just go through it again. So you really go knight to e4, and then given a chance, you capture on c3. You take a time out here to stop b4. You go a5, stopping that. And now you're just trying to aim for e5. And this is exactly what Gleck did with his pieces maneuvering. And then he got e5 in with a better position. So some final thoughts about the Dutch defence. Thank you for listening to these videos. Obviously, Dutch has been a long-term weapon of mine, and I still use it nowadays. And I think it's a great opening, very underrated. You can get some great attacks, as I've shown you in some of my games, against some of the best players in the world. It's worked out brilliantly for me. And I think it's a really good weapon, not so well known. It might take you a while to understand it. I recommend that before you dive in and play it, you look at some anti-Dutch lines, or even learn the French defense. So after d4, try to understand some possibilities with e6, because it's very rare your opponent's going to go e4 here, but you do have to be prepared for e4. So we've really concentrated on the g3 Dutch with these videos, so you should be very well prepared to play the classical Dutch against the g3 system. I wish you best results for that. And just remember the typical ideas. Try to get e5 in later on. So in this position, e5 is a key move. But another key idea is knight to e4, bishop to f6. And the other key idea is a5, just gain some space on the queen side. Queen e8, queen h5 should not be forgotten about either. So I really hope you enjoyed those videos. And please leave some comments. It might be... I know these videos are quite advanced because they're looking specifically at one variation, but we have combined it with when to attack in certain positions as well. So hopefully you've seen, as well as learning an opening, you've seen into my mind's eye and seen how I've gone about attacking and getting some great victories in my own games. And I wish you the best of luck with your Dutch games in the future. So I hope to see a new resurgence with the opening now. Okay, bye for now. Hope to see you all soon.